Welcome. I'm your host, Sheila Hyland. In the next half hour, we're going to take you on a journey to get the conversation started about domestic violence. We want to enlighten, educate, and create awareness about domestic violence. So we want to start off by introducing our guest, Amelia Williams. Welcome, Amelia.
Hi, Sheila.
Now, Amelia is a survivor of domestic violence and abuse. She can personally attest to the dynamics of domestic violence and its impact on personal identity. As president and founder of Ring of Hope campaign, she launched this initiative for promoting domestic violence awareness. It includes jewelry that she specifically designed to symbolize the fight against domestic violence, and I'm wearing one of her pieces today. Amelia is a domestic violence activist, public speaker, and social entrepreneur. She has made it her mission to spread awareness about domestic violence from here in Western Pennsylvania to a worldwide audience with this message. There is a light of hope to those living in the darkness of violence. And Amelia, when we think about domestic violence, we usually think about partner abuse. We think about women being abused. We often don't think about men or children. Can you give us some insight and some statistics into this?
Sure, I'd be happy to. 1 in 10 men and 1 in 3 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. 1 in 33 men have experienced an attempted or completed rape. Women of all ages are at risk for domestic violence, and they come back to the abuser about an average of 7 times before leaving permanently. And one of the highest risk groups is ages 16 to 24. They're at the greatest risk for experiencing domestic violence. At least 1 million women and 371,000 men are victims of stalking in the United States yearly. 15 million children in the United States live in families where partner violence occurred. So this is a national tragedy.
Yeah, and I want to mention to people who are watching, you'll see some numbers running across the bottom of your screen, and those numbers are to call if you need help for yourself or someone else.
Exactly. The Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, if you live in Pennsylvania, you can call that phone number. They can also call the United States National Coalition Against Domestic Violence hotline as well.
Okay. For those who may be watching this for the first time, can you give us some guidelines as to what actually constitutes domestic violence? Describe what forms abuse can take.
Domestic violence is a pattern of actions or threats of actions that are attempted to violate somebody to gain control or power. So a lot of times this can take different forms, such as verbal abuse, psychological abuse. It can also be stalking. It can be economic control as well.
So it's not just physical, as a lot of people might think.
Exactly. A lot of times when we think of domestic violence, we just think it's something physical or one person hitting another. And it's not just that. You know, it can be very psychological and very manipulative. And so any of this that would negatively affect another person's safety, health, or well-being would constitute domestic violence.
Your abuse started in childhood, which is an experience more common, unfortunately, than people might think. Tell us about your experience and your childhood.
Well, I lived with alcoholic parents for 19 years of my life. And I remember in elementary school years, I remember all of the boxes of gin and tonic and wine that they had purchased that they kept in the utility room. And a lot of times, my parents, every single month, they would actually order a keg of beer. Now, an American keg, we have few different types of kegs. An American keg is a half barrel. That is approximately 15.5 gallons, which is an equivalent of 165 12-ounce servings of beer.
Wow.
So if you can imagine, my parents were drinking that much every single month. So it included beer, it included vodka, and other forms of alcohol as well. I do remember a lot of times there was always a stench of smoke in the house because my father smoked a lot of pipes, cigars. My mother actually smoked cigarettes. So There was always really a stench, and they really didn't clean the house much. So when you'd walk in, you would really like smell these things. There were times also whenever I was alone with my mother at home during the day, if I had said something that she didn't like, what she would tell me is, wait until your dad gets home because he'll give you the belt. And so after a few repeated lashings of this, and this actually happened weekly, what I decided to do was wear a heavy robe and wear pillows underneath the robe. So when Dad would come home and actually beat me with a belt, I would pretend to scream, but I would be protecting myself as well.
Did you realize at the time that you were the victim of abuse, or did you think this is just the way that all families are?
I always knew when I was living at home there was always a lot of hollering, screaming, dissension. My parents were always throwing objects at me. They were throwing things at each other. But I saw them as authority figures, and so they always said, you know, it was my fault because they were drinking. It was my fault because they were angry. So I guess you could say at such a young age, I felt I didn't have much choice. They were my parents, and then I had to live with them.
So how did you get through things on a day-to-day basis? I mean, you put up with this abuse for many, many years.
I did. And one of the things I think that really helped me, I called it masking of thyself. And a lot of times after my parents would be drinking late at night and the next morning they woke up with hangovers. And if they would hit me, they would threaten me, they would throw things at me. And then sometimes the next day, they would remember exactly what they did. And what they would do is offer the credit card to me, and they would say, you know, do you want to use the card, go shopping, go buy yourself something, make yourself feel better. So I equated feeling better and my self-esteem with actually clothing and materialistic things. And quite honestly, I guess you could say that's how I got through it day to day. So I came home to a prison, and then when I was out in public, it was something where I always wore my makeup and I always made sure my hair looked good. I always made sure my clothing and accessories were coordinated.
When did it hit you that this wasn't normal? You said you blamed yourself, but when did you figure that all out?
Well, there were a few instances, and it wasn't right away. Back in 1990, there was a blizzard, and my best friend and I were actually stuck out on the road, on McKnight Road, and she had suggested that we stay at my parents' house. Now, deep down inside, I knew because of screaming, hollering, and violence, I really didn't want to go back to my house, but she insisted because my house was closer than hers, and we were in the middle of a blizzard. So when we got home, it was late, and I offered her my room, and I slept in the game room. Around 6 in the morning, my friend comes running to me, and she said, your mother just called me you, and she threatened to kill me. And at that point, I was so embarrassed because that was like my best friend, that she actually had to go through that. I never expected my mother would walk in her room and say those words. And she said to me, she said, this is not normal. And she said, I would suggest you leave here before you have any lives left. And so that was the first situation. The second situation was in 1991, whenever my father got hit by a car. This was on my graduation, and we were in the hospital. And when we were visiting that entire week, my mother kept saying, you know, I have to go home because there are things that I have to do, and it was getting to be the evening time. And so I thought to myself, what is it that Mom has to do that is more important than actually being with my father? Because he just got hit by a car, so he was unconscious. And it hit me when we went home. My mother had this routine of drinking. She would start to drink at 6 in the evening, and she would drink until 1 in the morning. And she'd also smoke her cigarettes as well. So I realized at that point in 1991 that there was a drinking problem, that both of my parents had the problem, not just my mother, but
so
my father.
how did you confront your parents then, and how did you finally get out of the situation that you were in?
There was one particular weekend I remember, and my parents often on the weekend, Friday and Saturdays, they would stay out mostly until 2 or 3 in the morning. So this was a Saturday night, and what happened was the next morning, which was Sunday morning, my parents were really, really hungover. They must have had consumed a ton of alcohol. And my mother again started to pick on me, and she started to threaten me, and she would say things about, how she didn't like what I was wearing, and just kind of really attack my character and start threatening me, threatening to punch and hit me. It was at that point that I had said to them, based upon the prior 2 experiences, I had said, you both have a problem with alcohol and you need to get help. At that point, my mother got really, really upset. She chased me up the steps, threatening to hit me. And I locked the door on the inside of my room, because on the doors, there were locks on the inside and the outside of the doors. And I locked my door at that point for safety, because she began to pound on the door. And at that point, I was packing my bags. I had made a decision. I thought, my best friend's right. This isn't normal. Now, it was a year later, mind you. Okay, it took some time. So I was packing my bags. I wanted to see if my mother had left. So I put my ear to the door. I didn't hear anything on the outside, because remember, there were locks on the outside.
Right.
So I unlocked the lock. The door actually opened. She didn't lock it from the outside. I had the suitcase in hand. I started to go down the steps. Both of my parents were in the living room. They actually heard me. And my mother said, "Where do you think you're going?" And I said, "I'm leaving this house." And that's when my mother had a knife in her hand, and she came after me, and she said, "Don't you leave this house." She said, "I'll kill you." So that is when I bolted out the door, and I ran around the side of the house, got into the car that my grandmother had been letting me use, and I drove away. But my mother was on the street, actually holding the knife over me while I was inside the car. And that's how I got out of the situation.
And I can even see today how it affects you just to talk about that so many years ago. So how did you overcome the psychological and emotional effects from your childhood?
I would say there were 3 key things. The first thing later on in my life was faith. I had looked to the Lord as my father in this situation, because I didn't really have a father. I also looked at him as my mother, as my parent as well. Now, I grew up in a household that was Catholic. So if you can imagine growing up in a religious household with domestic violence, I had a horrible impression of God, absolutely horrible. And when I left home, I had completely abandoned all notion of God and of faith. But then later on in my life, I had realized that the Lord had to be with me, even in this most tragic situation. The other thing that really, really helped me recover was education. Mm-hmm. So what I did was I went to a lot of Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. I had educated myself. There's a National Alcohol and Substance Abuse Information Center, and so they had a lot of different seminars. There's also a National Association for Children of Alcoholics. And so through all these associations and support groups, I got education, because I really had to know what was alcoholism and exactly how do people act when they're under the influence, and then what are the long-term effects of that. So it was through a lot of self-education. Even I went to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, not because I had a propensity toward alcohol, but because I wanted to see what it would be like if my parents ever got help, exactly what dynamics were involved.
You tried to get help for your parents with regard to alcoholism. Is that something you would suggest someone do, to try to get help for their abuser?
I would say it really depends upon each person's circumstance. If somebody is obviously in a life-threatening situation, they should immediately call 911. But from my experience, I would say that somebody should first consult a certified substance abuse counselor, and that that might be, the person, whatever chemical substance the loved one is abusing.
How often does alcoholism and drug use go hand in hand with domestic violence?
It's one of the riskiest behaviors. It really is. And when there's a battering incident involved, it can become more severe, and more life-threatening if the person is actually drinking.
Okay. I think people might be curious to know, Amelia, if you've ever been able to forgive your parents all these years later.
Forgiveness didn't come immediately. It took about 10 years because what I had to do was separate the love that I had from my parents from their problem with alcoholism. And that's very, very important for anybody who knows somebody who is drinking or under the influence of other substances. You must separate the behavior from the person. You don't have to accept the behavior, but you can still love the person.
Can you tell us how your experience as an adult child of alcoholics affected your behaviors and relationships into adulthood? Because I know it did.
There were a lot of different behaviors I had come to realize that I had. They were unhealthy considering the environment I grew up in. And one of them was guessing at what normal is. Adult children of alcoholics, we don't know what normal is because we lived in dysfunction, so we don't know that. Also, sometimes I also had difficulty following projects through from beginning until end, so I may have started something, may have not been able to finish it. I always had difficulty saying no to people, so more or less personal boundaries. I had personal boundary issues that I had to get resolved and become aware of, and also codependency issues. And codependency is where somebody has an unhealthy physical or psychological addiction to another person, much like they would to a chemical. And they feel a need to take that person's needs over their own and not take care of themselves. So I would say I overcame a lot, but I had to recognize these behaviors. I had to actually work with a therapist whenever I was in my 20s and be open to observations about my behavior.
You did overcome a lot, and you are now a domestic violence activist. You're involved with organizations that combat domestic violence. Tell us how you got involved with these organizations, and more importantly, why.
Well, I was approached by a local domestic violence program back in 2010 when I was designing jewelry, and they had asked me if I ever considered designing jewelry for domestic violence awareness. And I told them I would consider doing that, so I came up with one of my own designs. And I took the two best-selling items in my business, the crystals and the wire, and I came up with a design called the Ring of Hope jewelry. And at that time when I showed them the design, they had asked me if I would consider speaking to the press about my experience as a survivor. I was not open to that initially. And then I became more open to it as time went on, that I am supposed to give hope to others by speaking out. I'm not supposed to be silent. Domestic violence, it affects everybody all over the world, all races, all ethnicities, and all genders.
So how did you turn your talent as an artist and a custom jewelry designer into a vehicle for domestic violence awareness? You mentioned the ring, for instance.
The Ring of Hope jewelry has its own meaning and significance. The wire symbolizes the chaos of the domestic violence victim. The ring symbolizes the hope they hold from within to get out of the situation. The round symbolizes the survivor who's come up out of the chaos. They've straightened out their life, and they're a shining transformation for all to see. So when I started to design jewelry for this purpose, the speaking actually went with it. And so when I speak in organizations, I speak about all the different organizations that I work with, that I partner with, and the jewelry is more or less a vehicle for that. It's not a main focus, but it's beauty that comes out of the ugliness of domestic violence, because domestic violence is ugly.
And these really are beautiful symbols. They truly are. I don't know if the camera can really show them the way that we see them, but they are beautiful. We want to know who benefits from the Ring of Hope campaign exactly, and is it only domestic violence awareness groups that benefit from the cause?
Yes, every year I donate a portion of proceeds of the sales to 501c3 organizations who support domestic violence awareness, but they must be involved somehow in domestic violence awareness education, promoting domestic violence awareness, or offering domestic violence services to victims and survivors.
The Ring of Hope campaign is in partnership with the PA against Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Tell us about the relationship with that organization and other nonprofits that you work with and that you have working relationships with.
Yes, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, we have a partnership. I also promote their No More campaign as well. There is a national No More campaign to end domestic violence, and there's also a Pennsylvania Says No More website, which is a partnership between Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. And so these two organizations actually have partnered together, and there are survivor stories as well on the websites.
Okay. But this doesn't end with jewelry. Actually, there's a music initiative that you're working on as well. Tell us about that.
Yes, I have actually written and composed songs for domestic violence awareness, and these will be produced at a later time. I will launch the music separately as part of a larger project with Missions.
So tell us how, again, someone can get a little more information about the Ring of Hope campaign.
They can visit the website. It's www.ringofhopecampaign.com. And they can also call the numbers on the bottom of the screen if anybody has any kind of concerns with domestic violence, if they know somebody in a threatening situation. We have the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence number on the bottom of the screen, and also the national phone number as well.
Now, you also speak to a lot of organizations about domestic violence. That has to, I would imagine, be a very cathartic experience for you. It seems to be here. Who are you trying to reach with your messages, and what groups are you speaking to?
My primary audience is those who have left the domestic violence situation, so they're more or less survivors. And so I speak to them about, how to handle challenges in everyday life and to bring more awareness to them in their journey as a survivor. But I also can speak to victims as well and to give them hope in their situation, because there is hope.
I imagine that you encounter other men or women who were or are still involved in abusive relationships. These people who come to you, what do you say to them?
Generally, after speaking engagements, it's quite common. I will have victims come up to me and just kind of pour out their hearts, and basically I like to refer them to a legal advocate with a domestic violence shelter that can actually help them. And also I get people that come up to me asking, oh, I know so and so who is in this situation and I don't know what to do, what can you tell me? And basically I like to be very, very cautious with actually giving advice. We want to be supportive of the victim, and we want to be very, very loving, but it is they themselves that actually have to come to the decision about their situation. Some of them may still be in denial about it, like I was when my friend first confronted me. So we just really have to be wise with giving advice because each person's situation is different. But eventually they will realize for themselves what they need to do, and it's at that time that we need to support them in whatever decision that they make.
It's disturbing to think, too, that there are still a number of children who are currently living with abuse. How can we as adults recognize when children are being abused? Because even you mentioned you didn't want anybody to know, you didn't show the world that you had been abused.
Yes, and for children, we have a variety of different age groups. We have infants, we have preschoolers, we have pre-adolescents, adolescents, and we have teenagers. So with each of those age groups, there are specific behaviors to look for. I would say in general with children, any type of developmental delays, any type of very dangerous behaviors that they might have, any type of perhaps lacking in social skills, and just, being very, very afraid of people and situations that they're in. So for example, like an infant, might not be very, very responsive if an adult comes up to them, but an older child may actually engage in more threatening behavior. So with children, we have to watch the behaviors, watch the social development, and just watch the overall picture. And then, if we suspect something, we can call a local domestic violence program, or we can also consult with a certified substance and abuse therapist.
What about for adults? What programs, shelters, et cetera, are available if they're watching this program and they want some help? They know there's a number to call, but what would happen to them? What help is there for them out there?
Basically, there are 4 different types of resources for domestic violence victims. There are those programs that provide educational and community resources. There are also those that provide shelter and housing assistance, and those that provide intervention assistance and also transitional housing. So not all domestic violence programs provide the same services. However, if a victim would actually call Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, they can refer them to one of the 60 programs here in Pennsylvania based upon their situation, and nationally if they call the national hotline number as well.
So we definitely urge you to call if you need the help. I understand you have great hopes for the Ring of Hope campaign, that you want to take it beyond Western Pennsylvania. What are your dreams for the campaign, and what will it take to get that effort off the ground? And what are your dreams for ending domestic violence?
The Ring of Hope campaign was launched in 2010, in July of 2010. It was just me. And then as time went on, other businesses were inquiring as to exactly what I was doing with the Ring of Hope and how they could help with domestic violence awareness. So now Ring of Hope does have an advisory board and has a lot of different businesses supporting the initiative. In order to really get it off the ground, we're statewide right now, but in order to go nationally and worldwide with it, because domestic violence is not isolated to Pennsylvania, it's all over the world. This is a worldwide social problem. And so Ring of Hope would need funding to actually do that, because we have outreach initiatives that we want to do in the communities, at universities. These are things that we would actually do for the community. So to get it up and going, we actually need sponsors.
All right, so you heard the call to action. Amelia, I want to thank you for being our guest today and for enlightening us with your personal stories, your expertise, and giving hope to survivors of domestic violence and abuse. And we wish you the best with the Ring of Hope campaign.
Thank you, Sheila.
Now, if you'd like more information about the Ring of Hope campaign, to order Amelia's jewelry, or if you'd like to be a sponsor, or you can lend a helping hand to the campaign, please visit ringofhopecampaign.com. Amelia is also available to travel to give presentations on domestic violence. She will give your organization a realistic perspective on a subject which is usually treated as taboo. For more information on speaking engagements, please call 412-482-2768 or visit inspiremeamelia.com. And thank you for joining us. We do hope you'll spread the word about the Ring of Hope campaign.